Hello and welcome to Dialogue. At the just concluded 4-day Democratic National Convention, U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris formally accepted the Democratic Party's nomination for presidential candidate and delivered her vision to Americans, promising to create an opportunity economy. What are the takeaways from her speech? How do American voters feel about the two candidates? And who has more feasible proposals in solving pressing economic issues like inflation and rising unemployment? Join us for our discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qianduo. Joining me today are Adolfo Franco, attorney and Republican strategist, Brittany Lee Lewis, political analyst, and Ray Baker, adjunct professor from Towson University. So Brittany, welcome to the show. I'd like to start with you. So in her speech, Harris stressed that she'll create an opportunity economy, where everyone has a chance to compete and succeed, and also build the middle class, with a middle class tax cut. So what's your takeaway? It seems there's a strong enthusiasm. Do you think her prospect of winning the campaign against Trump is being boosted during this DNC?
Absolutely. I think it's clear that there is just having Kamala Harris now be the Democratic nominee has boosted the Democratic Party in a way that we really haven't seen, I would say, arguably, since President Obama was the nominee, right? She's coalesced so many various different groups of people. And she really talked about that in a lot of her story when she talked about where she grew up in a working class family, the fact that she is the child of immigrants, and she doubled down on the idea of freedom. And I think that's really the point that her and her campaign are trying to take home: the freedom to have clean air, the freedom to love who you choose, the freedom to bodily autonomy, right? And when we think about all the various groups that are interested in supporting Harris, one of the most unlikely, but is probably going to be so key in the election, are those Republicans that are moving over, that are picking country over party. And the reason why they're doing that is because they believe that Donald Trump is such a curse and a stain, a potential authoritarian to take over this country, that he is going to ultimately change democracy as we know it. So I think she stands a great chance, and I think the DNC really helps seal the deal and spread her message to the American public.
Adolfo, if looking at the DNC, as probably a Republican supporter, for example, how do they see, this strong enthusiasm and also the solidarity, with different groups expressing their support for Harris?
Well, I don't know who's expressing support, since this person has never confronted the American people or set her positions before the American people. She was never in any primary. She's never been elected by anybody, even the Democrats, until this switch. These were all Biden nominations. So talk about authoritarianism. This is the first time in our history that we've had a presidential candidate placed before the American people who has not been selected by the Democratic Party during the primary process. So much for authoritarianism. The so-called authoritarian president, Trump, was president for 4 years. I didn't see much authoritarianism, and most Americans, the vast majority, of course, saw the same thing. This is, in the cosmetic world, there's something called a makeover. This is a complete makeover by the press for the last 27 days. This woman was less popular than the unpopular President Biden. But here are the facts. A lot of freedom and other than abortion, what freedoms are they talking about? Her proposals that she's putting forward, and we'll talk about, will increase taxes. We'll talk about it a little later in the program on this. But this idea of running on joy and love reminds me of the riots in Seattle, where it was a summer of love when they were rioting. This woman has been part of this administration for the last 4 years. What about all the great opportunity economy and so forth? What have they been doing for 4 years other than having record inflation in our country, having a border that's out of control, having runaway crime? This is the incumbent. So she should be running on the record. I heard nothing about the Harris-Biden record. They're running away from it. So this is a nice propaganda and a nice commercial. When people start talking about joy and love in my family history, which she's done and the others, that tells you they don't have much to say. And this is exactly what the problem is for this administration. And they certainly cannot defend a record when 62% of the American people say the country is going in the wrong direction. That's under her watch. She is in power, and most people think the country is going in the wrong direction. This isn't about Donald Trump. Donald Trump had a successful presidency in terms of the economy, in terms of where we were in foreign policy. They've had an unmitigated disaster, and that's why they'll be rejected in November.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. Ray Baker, here, of course, we are talking about the economy policy, from Harris and Trump. Actually, both of them talked about, tax cuts. It seems like for different groups. So Harris criticized Donald Trump, saying, he fights for himself and his basically rich friends, billionaire friends. Is that the case?
I'd be curious to see Mr. Adolfo's stats about the 62% of Americans who believe the country is going in the wrong direction. I'm just curious about who did that type of polling, what the sample size of the audience would be, et cetera, et cetera. Now, a question as to whether or not that the economic policy will be more beneficial to one community of groups or another community of groups, I think frames the idea of government incorrectly. The framing of government is supposed to be the maintenance, welfare, and responsibility of a society. However, the framing of who tax breaks will benefit is a market answer. We cannot apply market answers to humane crises. What we're having right now in the United States around people feeling as though their money is not stretching as far as it once did, when we have people who are being being employed but not gainfully employed, feeling as though they're underemployed despite our employment numbers maintaining respectable levels, suggests to us that we're trying to apply market solutions to humane challenges. And so long as we do that, we'll constantly be in conflict. So when Ms. Harris suggests that she will offer a middle-class tax cut, she offers no way as to how we want to pay for such tax cut. Ironically, so does Mr. Trump. He does not suggest that it's a middle-class tax cut, but rather a corporate tax cut that he believes will result in ultimately what Ronald Reagan would usher in called trickle-down economics, which we have overwhelming evidence that doesn't benefit the vast majority of Americans who are workers in this country. And so there's no question for how that be paid for. But when we even invite the question of how something will be paid for, that continues to put forward market logics at the maintenance of society. And I think that as long as we continue to do that, we will be in a constant conflict that won't produce good market values, nor will it produce good outcomes for the society.
Mm-hmm. But can we say, Brittany, here, can we say this economy obviously is a central issue for the voters? It reminds me of, the famous saying, stupid is economy. So for this year's campaign, again, the economy is at the center. It's really about which candidate that can offer a viable solution to the economic problems, or whether they are real or not. It's really about how people feel about the economy, feel about their life, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this idea that, the whole entire campaign is about love and about people, first off, that's what politics should be, right? The personal is political. And I think to speak to the comment made earlier, which is really just this idea that trickle-down economics doesn't work. At the end of the day, a billionaire, right? Someone who has amassed tons of money, they are not invested in helping the poor and working class. It is not lost on us that more than 65% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, right? And we watched, there was a study that came out that said corporate profits accounted for 53% of the 2023 inflation, right? That Trump is he is a part of that group of individuals, right? At the end of the day, the system, right, especially when we talk about market analysis, we talk about Trump's plan for the economy, that plan isn't going to help the average working class individual. That plan is for big business. And at the end of the day, big business is tied to shareholder profit, not the average American working day to day that can barely put groceries on the table.
Mm-hmm. Well, Brittany, you are talking about the inflation, right? I mean, the inflation is actually coming down, 2.9%, but still, people feel, the cost of living, it's like a crisis. People say, you pay more, it's under pressure for the daily consumption. But still remember, Harris is the vice president, she has been there for the past 4 years. So is that a burden, or is that, now she offers solution to deal with that problem? What's the balance here?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's not just the vice president, right? This is a collective effort that has to be waged on behalf of everyone. But of course, as she steps into the role of president, she's going to do everything that she can to take on, like she did in 2018, the big banks, Wall Street, ensuring that we are capping prices for goods, right? Doing things as far as she can legislatively, right, in cohesion with the other parts of the government to cap these prices. At the end of the day, we know trickle down economics doesn't work. And we know that unless there are safeguards put in place, the market, right, is always going to benefit the rich.
So Ray Baker here, the proposal from Kamala Harris, including like a housing assistance and also probably, measures to stop price gouging. There are some criticism, I would say, against such a proposal. People say, oh, probably her government will try to control the economy or the market. What's your response to that?
Yeah, I think it was very interesting that Vice President Harris spoke a lot about freedom. And to Adolfo's point, the question of freedom seems largely about the autonomy of women to make decisions for their bodies, which absolutely should be one of those such freedoms. But if we apply the same logics of freedom to the housing market, then those real estate investors, those developers, those who are benefiting from the excessive prices of the American housing market would make the argument, and I would argue logically they are correct, that there is infringing upon freedom when you cap prices. You're infringing upon freedom when the weight of government comes down to, as Brittany suggests, control those prices. Now, to do that, infringing upon freedom serves in the welfare and the betterment of the vast majority of Americans, which invites all of us to engage with the conflict or the contradictions of how does freedom and how does equality and or equity live in the same house. And the tenets of Western democracy are freedom, equality, and national sovereignty. So how do those things all reconcile themselves? If we're talking about economic freedom, then we have to remember exactly what Brittany just told our audience, which is that economic freedom, the market, will tend to skew toward those who have the best leverage and pressure, which will undoubtedly be those with the greatest capital and resource. However, as the market is doing that in the United States right now, millions upon millions of Americans are struggling with housing costs. So the ideas and policy solutions that Vice President Harris have offered are public-private partnerships where she seeks to use the public weight of the office to leverage that against incentivizing private actors to now make housing costs more affordable. But if housing costs are more affordable, that would then be less profitable. That seems to work contradictory to the logics of the market. So we have to make decisions here. Are we for the freedoms of the market, which would threaten the welfare of the vast majority of Americans, or are we willing to be honest about some ways that government has to have some control to take care of and serve the benefit of the people that have elected that government?
Well, Adolfo, obviously, both candidates offered their solution to the inflation challenge here. Do you think there's a point in, say, assistance in housing and also probably some sort of role by the government in taking down the prices here?
Well, a couple of things. First, to be clear here, inflation under this administration, under Harris, has record, you said they were lower. The prices soared to 40-year highs, and now inflation, which continues to be a problem, is already compounding over the highest prices this administration has ever reached in the last 40 years. Secondly, when you asked about, my colleague asked about where the country and the people think is going in the wrong direction, 62%, that's a CNN poll, not exactly a right-wing poll from yesterday, if you want to check it. In terms of this price capping and so forth, this is price controls. This is government manipulation of the market. This is socialism. And this has not worked in our country. And it was tried last time in 1971 by President Nixon, a catastrophic effect in the 1970s inflation. Now, the Washington Post, which is a very liberal newspaper in this country, and the New York Times, arguably the most liberal, have ridiculed her economic plans correctly. This is on the left as gimmicks and not workable. These things do not work in a free capitalist system such as ours. This is socialist. If you want to embrace that, that's as she embraced Medicare for all, which now she says she doesn't support, which she was against fracking for oil, which now she says she doesn't support. So those are the facts. Other things on job growth in this country, the Labor Department just revised their numbers conveniently for the last year, down 818,000 jobs. The jobs that are being created in this country have been created by the government, or as my colleague said, part-time jobs. This administration's record is what she needs to run on, which has been an absolute disaster. Housing crisis, what have they been doing for the last 3.5 or 4 years? Is she waking up to these problems today? Now, my colleague says she's just the vice president. She said she was always the last one to leave the room, and certainly has embraced Bidenomics, her terms, for the last 3.5 years. So she owns this disastrous economy. She owns these failed policies. And the last thing I'll say about distribution of wealth in this country, two things. Since statistics are important, under President Trump's administration, 46% of the taxes in America were paid by the top 1% of our earners. Under this administration, only 42%. So wealthier people have paid less taxes under Harris than they did under President Trump. Lastly, every single American will have a tax increase if this woman is elected. Why? Because she has vowed to end the tax cuts that President Trump enacted. And those tax cuts expire next year, and they affect every single American. In addition, so just repealing that is a tax increase for every American. Secondly, she has proposed taxing unrealized capital gains on investments. So any American, whether they earn $20,000 or $50,000, and they have a 401k, a savings account in our country, they will be taxed on unrealized gains. What that means for the viewers is this: they will be taxed real dollars on things that are on paper. And if they lose value the next year, they've still paid the tax. This is cruel, and this is government manipulation. If you want government control of the economy through all these words that were used about housing and this, if you want the government directing the economy, if you want government trying to control prices, which is impossible in a free society, and as we've tried 50 years ago, then this is your candidate. If you want to continue with 4 years of an administration under President Trump that when he left office had 1.6% inflation on the day they took power, and they racked up inflation rates to up to 10% and have really never been below 3%, this is your candidate. Lastly, every single American paying for gasoline, paying for groceries, paying for insurance, paying for their cars today, which are high, these are all at record levels, well above the supposedly low inflation rates. That's why the majority of people believe the country is going in the wrong direction.
Well, Adolfo, of course, there's talk of, if there's a second term President Trump, he will make this tax break permanent. But then, as Harris said, that will create an additional $5 trillion to national debt. Is the national debt, which is already $35 trillion, a concern for the voters?
That is a very fair point. And that is a very fair point on a bipartisan basis. Somehow, years ago, the national debt and our spending, the national consciousness and the consciousness of our elected public officials was paramount and important. Somehow that fiscal discipline has been lost by both parties. And I agree, both are subject to dramatic criticisms. But I will say one thing as an example, and you're right on this, is President Trump, for example, proposed no tax on tips that servers raised. Initially criticized and ridiculed by the left, now she embraces the same policies. So I think, when President Trump put forward proposals that are concrete, they're attacked until they're embraced by the left. But to your point, the national debt and spending, the only way to do that is to reduce spending, not raise taxes, because raising taxes hurts every single American. So-called corporate taxes, they'll just be passed up. This woman is proposing increasing the corporate tax from 21% to 28%. That means every single American will pay more as these costs are passed on to consumers.
Well, of course, this is not policy yet. We are talking about the proposals here. Mr. Ray Baker, And Harris said that imposing, there's a proposal from Trump imposing steep tariffs on imports. She calls that as a national sales tax on everyday goods at Americans. Do you think, if there's a Harris government, do you think she will remove all those tariffs on imported goods, in particular, a lot of them from China?
So I think it's more interesting to have a conversation about what the logics of the market are. And I recognize I'm continuing to repeat a point that I've made already, but I think it's valuable for audiences to think about this in the macro as opposed to the micro. Whether we're talking about whether corporate taxes will be passed along to consumers, whether we're talking about the cost of increase in tariffs will be passed along to consumers, every time we engage this conversation, we're looking at whether or not there are market logics that will suffice for providing for a society. If that is the society we want, the society where we are submitting to the market, which my colleague correctly suggested that the United States is a capitalist country, which I would push back to argue that it is a capitalist country in crisis because it often interferes in the logics of the market. We had a colleague who continually referenced 1971. I would point to the 1940s and the New Deal and some of the government interventions that then created the United States as relative, if not one of two, the standalone superpower in the course of the modern world. Though that involved a great deal of government intervention in ways that would be haphazardly referred to as socialism right now. So when you ask specifically your question about the tariffs and whether or not that would be useful or how that would affect the American consumer, so long as the American consumer and so long as our elected officials are always putting market solutions in the hands of enterprise and then leaving all of us as consumers and producers in a marketplace exchange with one another, the person who has the leverage, who can set the price, who looks to make sure that their profits maintain where they want them to be, will always have the advantage and leverage. So we can make whatever policies proposed the argument that the cost will only be passed along to the consumers and this will serve them in an adverse fashion so long as we are existing in this crisis of capitalism. And so I don't mean to just flat out ignore your question, but I think we demand, particularly at this critical juncture in the United States history, a broader scope in order to decide what type of society do we want to be a part of, what type of market, what type of rules do we want to govern our society. And so long as the market logics are governing our society, we're going to continue to see that over and over. Lastly, I appreciate the time to go on this. We're hearing a lot about inflation, but we've also seen reports that there have been businesses and corporations that have seen the COVID pandemic and the excess and the need for inflation over the course of the last 4 years that have increased and in practice price gouging in ways that are inconsistent with even the logic of capitalism and markets. Why? Because the opportunity for profit is there. And how do you disincentivize a company premised on making money from making money? So long as we are committed to these market logics, then we're going to be a society that is a capitalist but in crisis because we continue to intervene, as we say, in search of or in need to defend our citizens, to provide protections and help, but those protections and help aren't adequate because they violate all the rules of market capitalism.
Well, there's a lot to explore in that respect. Let's move on. Brittany here, Harris said, basically criticized Donald Trump as an unserious man. Having him for a second term is extremely serious. It seems like, Trump is another focus, basically, for different groups, different probably people, supporting the Democrat side, the candidate. They are all somehow united in the fight against Trump or preventing Trump from the return to the White House. And now you can have basically on average the national polls have Harris ahead of Trump about 3%, 3 points there. Do you think such enthusiasm will sustain? Is it temporary? Will it go in the next 3 months?
Yeah, I think the enthusiasm is going to sustain itself. I think the reality that, the last 2 Republican presidents do not stand behind Donald Trump. First and foremost, I think that signals everything that we need to know about who this man is and what he represents. I think the simple fact that you have all of these Republicans, and I mean, these are big name Republicans, right, who are coming out and saying we are anti-Trump, calling on their fellow Republicans to do the right thing. They literally said at the DMC, several of the Republicans that were there, they said, we are begging you to put country over party, because they see Donald Trump as a threat to democracy as we know it. They've said, we don't agree with all of Kamala Harris's policies, but we do believe in the idea that we should have freedom here, right? As advanced, as brought forth by the forefathers of the United States. And it's very clear, Donald Trump, you want to talk about authoritarianism, he has repeatedly put forth fascist language, right? He has repeatedly tried to talk about ripping away autonomy, using the various aspects of the US government for his own needs, right? At the end of the day, it's evident that Donald Trump doesn't care about the average American, right? He cares about lining his own pockets and helping his other billionaire friends. That is incredibly evident. He doesn't care about democracy, people having the opportunity to choose. He literally, if you just think about what fascism is, all of his policies and his ideologies are directly tied to the very notion of fascism. So I think it's very clear, and I think the simple fact that so many conservatives are getting behind Harris, that she is going to ultimately become the next president of the United States.
Well, Alfredo, what do you say about this, Republicans, activists, including former officials from the Trump administration, stand behind Harris, basically saying no to Trump for the second term?
I don't see any conservatives lining up with with Vice President Harris. I could tell you, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, who ran for president and is a Democrat, is supporting President Trump. I can tell you that Robert Kennedy Jr., the Kennedy family, is going to endorse President Trump today. These are never Trumpers. These are really Republicans in name owner. I hope this rhetoric, this hot rhetoric, continues, because the facts are still the facts. And here, just very quickly on this, is you still have we didn't talk about this, 10 million illegals coming across the border. That's the number one and number two issue in most of the swing states and throughout the country. Inflation is still the number one concern for most Americans. That's what they're going to be deciding this election on. Price gouging, grocery stores, which people face, the grocery store margin today is 1.6% profit at one of the historical lows. If this was so much price gouging, if there were so many problems in America, where was this woman and President Biden for the last 4 years? That's the question to be asked here. So when you look at this in its totality, you have to run on a failed record. You're not, my due respect to Brittany, people experienced Donald Trump for 4 years. You can use this hot rhetoric and so forth. They don't think he's a fascist. They didn't see the country fall apart. They just saw peace abroad, prosperity at home, and a future that was very, very bright until the COVID crisis affected our country. The last thing I'll say about tariffs, which affects our Chinese friends, and China's the following. I did not see President Biden lift the Trump tariffs. Biden-Harris criticized those tariffs, and those tariffs remained in full, complete force during the Harris-Biden administration. This is, again, the hypocrisy of this woman.
Well, on that note, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.